As we start studying Romanticism, it's important that you also have a little bit of background in what lyric poetry is. So, some background on lyric poetry. First of all, lyric poems express the personal thoughts and feelings of a single speaker. And of course, we assume that that speaker is usually the poet, though it doesn't have to be. The form originates from the ancient Greeks. Originally, these were sung, they were not recited, and they were sung with the accompaniment of the lyre, which is a type of musical instrument that has strings and it's played along with the recitation of the poem. Lyric poems are relatively short, so you're not going to find normally long pages and pages and pages of the same poem. These are usually pretty short. And lyric poems usually have some kind of single unifying effect. So there's something that links the whole poem together from beginning to end. 3 different types of lyric poetry. The first type is the ode. The ode is considered to be very serious. It's usually very emotional. The ode is designed to pay respect to a person or a thing. So it doesn't have to be a person. We can have an ode to a thing like Ode to a Summer's Day, for instance. And in this type of poem, the speaker is directly addressing the subject. So if I'm writing an ode to my grandfather, my poem it's as if it's speaking directly to my grandfather. If I'm writing an ode to summer, it is like I'm talking directly to summer. The second type of lyric poem is an elegy. Elegies are very solemn and formal. They're usually done upon the death of someone or something. And it's important to recognize that we normally hear about elegies in response to the death of a person, but we could absolutely have an elegy related to the death of an idea. So maybe an elegy written to the death of innocence or the death of childhood or something along those lines. And then the third type of lyric poetry is the sonnet. You've had some experience with sonnets before. You did them when we studied Shakespeare. You should know by this point that the sonnet has 14 lines, has some form of specific meter, and some specific rhyme scheme. And we did do that earlier in the year. You can always go back for a refresher. It was back in the Shakespeare section before we studied Macbeth. Elements that lyric poems often contain are different types of figurative language. Important to recognize that a lyric poem does not need to include all of these. These are just some examples of things that you may find in lyric poems. And these should all be review for you. We have simile, where we're comparing one thing to another using the words like or as. So, for instance, if we say that his heart was cold like ice, that's a simile. We're comparing his heart to ice, and we're using the word like in. Metaphors are very similar to similes, except for now instead of using the words like or as, we say that one thing is another. So his heart was ice in response to the girl's pleas. We're saying that his heart was ice. Again, it's a comparison. We're comparing it to the nature of ice, cold, unyielding. But we're actually saying it is that item. We also have personification. Remember, personification is giving human traits to non-human things. So, for instance, we could take something like the heart and say, his heart ran from the sheer idea of falling in love. Now, obviously, that heart did not grow legs and run like this picture depicts. We've given the heart personal traits. Think about movies like Beauty and the Beast. I always use that as my example. In Beauty and the Beast, we have the teacups and the candlesticks and all of the plates. They all have legs, they dance, they sing, they talk. That's all examples of personification. Anytime we give human traits to something that is non-human. Also may include oxymorons. An oxymoron is when you put two things together that seem to be complete opposites. So, for instance, the cold heat of his eyes. Well, when we think about heat, obviously we think about warmth. So by putting the idea of cold in front of it, now we've created an oxymoron. Other elements of lyric poetry may include various sound devices. Again, much of this will be review. Some sound devices include repetition. Could be a sound, could be a word, could be a phrase, could be a sentence. Repetition of sounds, there are specific names for different types of this form of repetition. The first is alliteration. Alliteration has always been my personal favorite. It's when we repeat initial consonant sounds within the same sentence or the same couple of sentences. So, for instance, dangerous dogs dig ditches in Denver. There we have the repetition of that D sound. Alliteration catches your ear, makes you pay attention, and it's just a lot of fun, in my personal opinion, to see how many you can string together. So, I always like to see good examples of alliteration. Consonance is the exact opposite of alliteration. Alliteration were initial sounds. Consonants are end sounds. So, for instance, if you had a sentence, the fish ate from a dish and then he went swish, that SH sound at the end, that would be consonants. We've repeated it 3 times. Fish, dish, swish. Assonants are similar vowel sounds. So maybe in a sentence you have cat, bat, and black in there. That A sound would be assonance. And of course, you know what rhyme is. We can have external or end rhyme. That's at the end of a sentence. You can also have internal rhyme, where you have words in the middle of your sentences or lines of poetry that rhyme. And again, remember, a line of poetry does not have to be a complete sentence. Oftentimes, sentences carry over from one line to the next. And onomatopoeia are words that sound like sounds. So pop, buzz, fizz, hiss are all examples of onomatopoeia. So what do you need to do to actually figure out what lyric poetry is talking about? There are a couple of questions to ask yourself. First thing you need to do is to use your senses, because lyric poetry is big on appealing to your senses. So how is the imagery, things that are appealing to your 5 senses, things that appeal to your sense of taste or touch or sight or sound or smell, how does the poet use that imagery to show emotion and mood? Maybe the poem is very light and airy and they talk about the smell of the flowers. How does that show then the mood of the poem? And how does the imagery relate to the message? What is the message of the poem itself? What is the author trying to convey to you? And then how does he use that imagery to get that point across to you? And you really need to take some time to analyze that message. So, as you read a lyric poem, what are the thoughts and the feelings of the speaker? And then, do those thoughts and feelings seem true? Do they seem real? Or are they fabricated? Are they made up? And then, you always want to see if you can relate it to your own thoughts and feelings. So, do they match with things that you've experienced in your own life? Do they not match? Maybe you haven't had an exact experience like that, but something similar. So you always want to try to connect it to your own life in some way. Is this authentic or is this fabricated? Is this completely made up and not realistic? Some questions I'd like you to answer, please, in your submission block. Where did lyric poetry originate? So where did it come from? What is the difference between an ode and an elegy? Please be specific. I want an example of personification other than the examples that I've given you already. Okay, I gave you an example on the screen. I also talked a little bit about examples of personification. Give me something other than what I talked about. I talked about my favorite type of sound device. Yes, I'm a bit of a nerd when it comes to that, so make sure that you paid attention to that. Always good to know what the teacher likes. And what is the key to figuring out lyric poetry, since ultimately that's what you need to do for this class. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to give me a call or email me. Thanks.